Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're tackling one of the absolute biggest events in human history, World War I. I know, history can sometimes feel like a massive blur of dates and names, but today, we're going to zoom way out. We're looking at the big picture to see exactly how the entire world got pulled into this giant, unprecedented conflict over a century ago, and how it literally redrew the map of the world.
To make this super easy to follow, we are breaking this epic story down into 5 simple chapters: the rival alliances, the Sarajevo spark, trenches and new weapons, the U.S. enters, and finally, a redrawn map.
All right, Chapter 1, The Rival Alliances, a Web of Promises.
So, picture early 20th century Europe as this highly competitive playground. You had older, established empires like Britain and France who already had huge territories across Asia and Africa, and then you had these newer, really fast-growing powers like Germany and Italy who kind of wanted their own piece of the pie, right? It was a total recipe for jealousy. So, to protect themselves, they formed these giant teams. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy became the central powers. On the flip side, Britain, France, and Russia teamed up as the allied powers. It was basically a massive web of promises, meaning if one country got into a fight, everyone else on their team was locked in to jump in and help. They were all just building up their militaries, waiting for something to snap.
Which brings us right to Chapter 2, the Sarajevo Spark, the Powder Keg.
With these two heavily armed teams just staring each other down, all it took was one tiny spark to set off the whole explosion. And that spark? It hit on June 28, 1914. The Archduke of Austria-Hungary, the guy next in line to rule the whole empire, was assassinated by a Serbian group in the city of Sarajevo. Well, Austria-Hungary was absolutely furious. They blamed Serbia, sent them a list of practically impossible demands, and when Serbia naturally refused, Austria-Hungary officially declared war.
And here is where we see that crazy domino effect in action. Because of those giant alliance teams we just talked about, a fight between two countries was never going to stay small. Russia steps in to protect Serbia. Then Germany steps in to help Austria-Hungary, declaring war on Russia and France. And when Germany decides to march right through neutral Belgium to get to France, well, Britain couldn't just stand by, so they declare war on Germany. It's wild. In literally just a few days, all the dominoes fell, and the world's major powers were at war.
So, let's look at Chapter 3. Trenches and new weapons, a new kind of war.
Now you'd think this lightning-fast race to war would mean fast-paced battles, right? Actually, scratch that. Once the actual fighting started, everything completely stopped. Instead of moving forward, armies got entirely stuck and just dug deep, muddy ditches into the ground to hide from enemy fire. This was trench warfare. Try to imagine being stuck in a freezing, wet ditch for months on end. These two sides dug in across this massive 780-kilometer line, stretching all the way from the North Sea down to Switzerland. Millions of soldiers were just trapped in this slow, agonizing reality where nobody could easily push forward without absolutely devastating losses. So how do you break a muddy tie like that? Well, armies turned to some genuinely shocking, brand-new scientific inventions. Since you can't just run across the battlefield anymore, they brought in terrifying new tools. This was the very first time massive armored tanks went rolling through the mud. First time airplanes flew overhead to scout out positions and actually drop bombs. They introduced terrible things like poison gas. And out in the ocean, Germany was using these entirely new submarines called U-boats to sneak up on ships from totally out of sight under the waves. War had completely changed forever.
Moving on to Chapter 4, the U.S. enters, breaking the stalemate.
By 1917, everyone is just exhausted. Russia actually had to leave the war entirely because a massive revolution broke out back home. People were starving, they'd had enough. So the Allies desperately needed help. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America had been trying so hard to stay out of the actual fighting. They were neutral, preferring just to sell weapons and supplies. So what happened? Why did the US suddenly decide to jump into this terrifying global conflict? Well, it basically boiled down to two massive breaking points. First, those German submarines we mentioned, they kept attacking ships out in the ocean, including neutral trade ships just trying to deliver everyday goods. That made Americans incredibly angry. But the real final straw was literally like something out of a spy movie. The US intercepts this shocking secret message where Germany is actually asking Mexico to team up and attack the United States. I mean, you can imagine, the US was furious. And on April 2nd, 1917, the United States officially declares war on Germany.
This was a total game changer. By July of 1918, you had 650,000 fresh, well-supplied American troops landing in Europe. Keep in mind, both sides were completely drained from years of fighting. So this massive injection of new energy and supplies, it was exactly the relief the Allied powers needed to finally break that awful stalemate and push the Central Powers back for good.
Which brings us to our final chapter. Chapter 5, a redrawn map, the aftermath. Facing total defeat, the Central Powers start collapsing one by one. The German Emperor flees, and on November 11, 1918, Germany officially surrenders. But the scale of loss? It's almost hard to wrap your head around. Roughly 1.5 billion people globally were dragged into this conflict in some way. An unbelievable 10 million soldiers died, and over 20 million were wounded. It financially ruined Europe, costing an estimated $85 billion. And this tragedy went way beyond Europe's borders. For instance, over 30,000 Vietnamese soldiers tragically died and 60,000 were wounded, forced to fight for France in unfamiliar lands thousands of miles from home. Just a truly global tragedy.
When the peace treaties were finally signed, the victors punished the losers pretty severely. Germany lost territory, and their military was basically reduced to nothing. And the map of Europe? Completely redrawn. Think about this. 4 giant, powerful empires that had literally existed for centuries just entirely collapsed and vanished from the map. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, all gone. Out of their ruins, a whole bunch of new, smaller countries were suddenly born.
So, the so-called war to end all wars was over, and they even created the League of Nations to try and keep the peace. But it leaves us with this huge kind of dark historical cliffhanger. Did these extremely harsh punishments, these massive debts, and this completely broken, redrawn map of Europe actually plant the seeds for World War II just 20 years later? The anger and instability left behind? Well, it definitely opened the door for extreme political movements to take hold. It really makes you think about how the end of one story so often becomes the exact beginning of the next. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning history.